victims. Chemicals recommended by the CRC for listing on Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention are yet to be listed by the apologies for the late start. Obviously, plenary went on a little bit longer, and it's a matter that obviously somewhat discussed in this side event that's very important there. Those that I haven't met before, my name is Liam O'Brien. I'm an Assistant Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, the big trade union body in Australia, and I'll be moderating this evening's event. This event is co-organised by labour organisations, including the ACTU, also Union Aid Abroad at FIDA and Solidar Swiss, along with public interest NGOs, Pesticide Action Network and IPEN, and is really leveraging this year's theme of the POPs in making visible the invisible occupational health and safety victims of chemicals. This event will be recorded and we will make available this recording. Consent is not provided for any other recordings of attendees and not to make any recordings of this event. As I said just previously, workers are the first and last users of chemicals, with more than 1 billion workers worldwide exposed to hazardous substances. Tragically, each year, as a result of these exposures, more than 1 million workers will die, including hundreds of thousands from exposure to chemicals been recommended for listing this COP, in some cases for as much as 20 years. As many will be aware, in June 2022, the ILO's International Labour Conference decided to amend the ILO Declaration on the Fundamental Rights and Principles at Work to include a safe and healthy working environment as a fundamental principle and right of work. This landmark decision elevating the right to a safe and healthy working environment means that all 187 member states now have an obligation to respect, promote and realise this new fundamental right. This evening's event will show how this important decision is creating greater awareness of occupational victims of hazardous chemicals and encouraging stronger action to prevent exposures. The panel brings together experts in the areas of occupational safety and health, human rights and international law and the environment, along with real-life experience of workers on the front line of hazardous chemical exposures. We'll highlight not only the importance of a rights-based approach to occupational safety and health and chemicals management, but also the valuable role that the Rotterdam Convention, and in particular its PIC procedure, can play in enabling these rights, and specifically the right to know. In doing this, we'll highlight not only the important role the Convention can play in preventing hazardous exposures, but also the challenges that it's currently facing in failing to list chemicals that have met all criteria for listing, but yet remain blocked. This evening's event, we are joined by 3 experts and global leaders in chemical safety. We've got Helga Grassi from the International Labour Organization and Ana Paula Souza from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights. In addition to these experts, we'll present 2 case studies that highlight the devastating and human cost of failing to list certain hazardous chemicals. These will be presented by Philip Hazelton from Union Aid Abroad, and Sheila Lewis from Pesticide Action Network. Finally, we will importantly hear from a much respected party representative, who is the head of Poland's unit for international instruments, Department of Risk, Bureau of Chemical Substances. We'll hopefully provide some time at the end for questions that can be put to the panel, so please give some consideration to the questions that you would like to ask. It is now my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ana Paula, to provide a short overview of the economic and social rights, in particular in the environmental area, and highlight the importance of the right to know in the context of chemical management.
Thank you very much. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is delighted to support this side event, which is addressing head-on blatant human rights harms caused by hazardous chemicals. The very reason we're here today, why treaties such as the BRS conventions come to exist, is the vast body of evidence that shows how toxic chemicals are responsible for ongoing massive human rights harms that negatively affect multiple aspects of human life and dignity. Recent and ongoing developments in the chemicals and waste cluster increasingly link environmental health protection and human rights. For example, we can mention the General Assembly adoption in July 2022 of a landmark resolution recognizing the human right to a clean, health and sustainable environment. As Liam said, in June 2022, the ILC adopted a resolution recognizing a safe and healthy working environment as a fundamental principle supporting a just transition. The IOC also decided to designate 2 occupational safety and health conventions as fundamental conventions. Then in May 2023, the World Health Assembly adopted a resolution regarding the impact of chemicals, waste, and pollution on human health, which affirmed the need to tackle pollution as a cornerstone of achieving sustainable development goals. The Global Framework on Chemicals, adopted in September 2023, recognized that the implementation of the sound management of chemicals and waste contributes to the full enjoyment of human rights and human well-being and dignity. Framework also calls for the phase-out of highly hazardous pesticides in agriculture by 2035, particularly where the risks are not managed and safety are available. Ongoing negotiations, including at the INC, the Plastics Treaty negotiations, and the open-ended working group on the Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste, and Pollution Prevention, represent efforts contributing to increasing synergies and cooperation for the implementation of the PRS conventions amongst other communities. Let me turn now to the synergies between human rights and the Rotterdam Convention. Human rights law imposes specific duties on states to respect, protect, and fulfill everyone's rights, me, yours, ours, including to the highest attainable standard of health and to a clean, health, and sustainable environment. Safe and healthy working conditions as a fundamental aspect of the right to just and favorable conditions of work have been explicitly recognized as a human right since 1966, with the adoption of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The Convention on the Rights of the Child recognized the rights of the child to be protected from performing any work that is likely to be hazardous or harmful to the child's health and physical development. Under the International Convention on the Rights of all Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, migrants, temporary workers have a right to equality and to enjoy equal treatment to national in respect of safety and health and other conditions of work. According to the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, women workers have a right to special protection during all periods that pose reproductive risks to them as well as to their offspring, which requires protection from work that exposes them, other fetus, to toxic chemicals. The Human Rights Committee, the body that supervises the implementation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, found toxic exposure can violate the right to privacy and family life enshrined in Article 17 of the Covenant. I may have lost you now with so many references to treaties and standards, but I was told that was important to give this initial context. So maybe I left you wondering, what does this mean in practice? We know that asbestos, for example, alone, is a major cause of occupational deaths, responsible for over 200,000 work fatalities annually and a long list of health effects. The highly hazardous pesticides being blocked for listing, I will not attempt to say their names here, are known for adverse effects on the nervous system, liver, thyroid, kidneys, and reproductive organs, with associated high number of cases and fatalities. Putting simply, as also put forward by the Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights, acute poisoning, other cases of extreme exposure to toxic substance, and long-term chronic exposure to toxic substance are unquestionable violations of human rights. Human rights law imposes the duty on states to prevent and minimize exposure to hazardous substances. This means that states must do everything in their power to protect all people in their territory and/or jurisdiction from exposures to toxic substances, taking appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, punish, and provide redress through effective policies, legislation, regulation, and enforcement, as well as adjudication. States also have a duty to protect those harmed by business activities, which means that victims of business-related human rights abuses must have avenues to redress. Additionally, under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, business have a responsibility to respect human rights and to prevent and address any adverse impacts arising from their operations as part of their due diligence expected from them. And this is why the Rotterdam Convention is a key tool in fulfilling human rights obligations. The failure to list recommended chemicals undermines the protection of human rights and threatens the right to information, the right to science, the right to life, health, a clean and healthy environment, food, water, housing, rights at work, amongst others. The inability to add these chemicals to the list prevents access to vital scientific information and enable misinformation campaigns. As pointed by the Special Rapporteur on Toxic and Human Rights, in some countries, the asbestos industry has blocked regulations through campaigns suggesting that asbestos is not toxic, or alternatively, that the controlled use of asbestos can be safe. And this is why the current paralysis of the Rotterdam Convention is so troubling. As we know, the prior informed consent procedures ensures that countries have the right to know about the highly hazardous chemicals and pesticides entering their borders. This knowledge allows them to take appropriate regulatory actions to protect health and the environment. However, a few countries and a heavy industry lobby have been blocking the listing of highly toxic pesticides, as well as chrysotyl asbestos, for many years, despite meeting all the criteria for listing and having the unanimous support of the Convention's Chemical Review Committee. The listing of chrysotyl asbestos in the Convention has been considered by the COP since its third meeting in 2006. Constructive attempts at resolving this crisis of the Convention at COP 2023 were undermined, and we see further suggestions of weakening the conventions being proposed this year. Who benefits from this situation? I can say without any hesitation that the answer is not with those whose health and life are directly impacted: workers and their families, including peasants and other rural workers and indigenous people. Global action and inaction, fueled by failure of policymakers and business to respect human rights, are hurting us deeper and deeper into environmental catastrophe. Politicians, lobbyists, and executives walking the corridor of powers continue to turn their back on the scientific evidence. We see industry and governments employ so-called experts who excel in sowing doubt and undermining scientific fact. We also see heavy corporate influence on regulatory processes. For decades, big industry, including the fossil fuel, agricultural, plastics, automobile industries, and so on, have suffocated scientific evidence at the expense of the right to health. In closing, blocking hazardous chemicals from being listed in Annex 3 undermines the Convention's effectiveness and its core purpose and puts human rights at risk. I appreciate and thank you all in this room and beyond who are tirelessly trying to ensure science and human rights matter, and that those who put profits before people are held accountable. Thank you, Ian. Sorry for
Wonderful. I think this dovetails very nicely to our next speaker. I mentioned at the start the importance of a right to a healthy and safe working environment. The fact that the ILO now recognises it as a fundamental principle and right at work. CRC is going to now explore this a bit further and talk about the impact chemicals have on workers' health.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Liam. A pleasure to be here with you all. I'm representing the International Labour Organization. The ILO is a specialized UN agency, first founded in 1919, so more than 100 years ago, and in that year already creating legally binding labor standards for chemical hazards. So for more than 100 years, we've been working with our constituents who are the workers, employers, and ministries of labor around the world. We have 187 member states to ensure a safe and healthy working environment for workers globally. So let me set the scene a little bit, taking it over from Ana Paula, and why chemical exposures represent a global health crisis for workers around the world. Our estimates show that workers are exposed to monumental amounts of chemicals. We know there's more than 1 billion workers around the world exposed. This results in more than 1 million deaths per year. Approximately one worker loses their lives every 30 seconds due to hazardous chemical exposures alone. And this is not only due to fatal accidents, this is due to chronic lifelong diseases, disabilities. And we know that all of these deaths are entirely preventable due to many different types of protective measures that have been in place for more than 100 years. And so this marks a global health crisis for the world of work and something that demands our urgent attention. So let's dive deep into this now about chemical exposures that take place and why we're looking at such a difficult issue to deal with. So the theme is making visible the invisible. When it comes to chemical exposures at the workplace, many of these exposures are indeed invisible. If you see the different types of exposures that workers can be exposed to, we're talking about gases, vapors, fumes, dusts, fibers. These are things that create a cocktail of hazard for workers in the workplace. They're exposed usually to many different types. The reality is that workers don't work in a bubble, and they're not exposed only to one type of chemical, and they can be exposed to many at the same time or many throughout their different work shifts or throughout their work occupations. We also can't ignore the fact that workers are not only working with chemicals. There are a plethora of other kinds of workplace hazards that can make the chemical exposures even more potent. Thinking about climate change and excessive heat exposures, psychosocial hazards. We're talking about workers also that are working in the informal economy and might be already burdened by high levels of poverty. And so this creates a burden for workers that is immense and very difficult to deal with in many settings. When it comes to the health impacts from these different exposures, we have to remember that there can be acute impacts, poisonings from pesticides, but then long-term chronic health impacts, things like asbestosis, many different types of cancers from asbestos. These are diseases that have long latency periods, further making it more complex from the exposure to the health outcome and not having that causal link in all times. We also have the risk of major industrial accidents due to incorrect storage, stockpiling, and the risk for workers as well as the broader community. And as a reminder here that when we think about workers being exposed, we think about workers being exposed within factory walls. But in fact, workers can be exposed throughout the supply chain, from extraction to disposal, and of course, things like waste picking. Now, how do we respond to this crisis? Pretty grim, the picture that I just showed, but what do we do? What can we do at the international, national, and workplace level? And how can the ILO work with BRS and also with different stakeholders that are here in the room? In every level that we work on, we want to have a cross-sectionality of social dialogue. This is when we have workers, employers, and governments meeting together to discuss the most effective solutions for that specific situation. And so we do all of the work coming up in the spirit of social dialogue. The first step is creating a legal framework for what can be done. And the legal framework is created through legally binding ILO conventions. Legally binding ILO conventions sets the framework for what should be done in the world of work. And they're also superseded by different types of recommendations and codes of practice. The legal framework for action, I want to discuss what was mentioned before in the decision in 2022 to make occupational safety and health a fundamental principle and right at work. This means that all 187 member states of the ILO have the obligation to implement this right in all workplaces around the world, whether or not they have ratified the two fundamental conventions on OSH, which are 155 and 187. Now, an important right that's enshrined in these conventions is the right for workers. Workers have many different types of rights under these conventions. And it's important to think about them here in the context of BRS, in the context of protection from chemicals. This is the right to information, understanding workplace risks and hazards, things like the provision of chemical safety data sheets so that workers are informed of the chemicals that they're using. This is not only about the right to information, but the second bullet about the right to training and education on these chemicals. So it's not just enough to know, workers must also be trained on how to appropriately respond to those hazards. Further, we have the right to participate. Workers have the right to be involved in decision-making at the workplace, and very importantly, the right to remove themselves from a potentially hazardous situation. So I want to move now to the Chemicals Convention. It's the most important one here in our discussion. It's directly interlinked with the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions. And here briefly, I'll mention that this chemical convention has direct implications for workers' rights and their rights to be protected at the workplace. So even in the preamble, workers' rights are enshrined, that workers have the need and the rights to information about the chemicals they use and about appropriate protective and preventative measures. How do they prevent exposures and how can they protect themselves? I want to mention a very important point here about chemicals and the listing under Annex 3. So when I told you that the ILO was founded in 1990, and we started our work already back then on the protection of workers from chemical hazards, there was no discrimination when it came to the types of chemicals that workers should be protected from. In our Chemicals Convention and other complementary conventions, it's very clear that workers should be protected from all chemical hazards in the workplace. We have no listing of which chemical should be included or not. These include all chemicals. And here we have a very important article, a legal provision in our Convention 170 that says specifically that exporting member states shall inform if there's a reason that the chemical is prohibited partially or fully in the exporting state. So we have in a way already informed consent procedure enshrined in our chemicals convention for all chemicals without any kind of listing procedure. So this is where the intersectionality between sectors is critically important. We need better engagement between labor sector officials, environmental officials, and health officials to make these kinds of procedures a reality, regardless of the type of chemical that might be that we might be talking about. So these are an additional list of the chemicals, chemical conventions that the ILO has, and we have a website where you can check which chemical convention has been potentially ratified by your member states. So I'll wrap it up here just to say, where do we go from here? We know that we have to make visible the invisible. When we're talking about chemicals, there are many different types of chemicals, and we need to understand in a more precise way, what are the priorities at the national, at the local, at the community level? We have a very good global overview. We understand where our priorities lie, but what about the priorities of our constituents? And so we'd like to talk about that. We also have to make sure that we're not only talking about the individual chemicals, but we're talking about the people. Who are the workers that are invisible right now? How do we make those workers visible? Whether that's the informal sector, whether that's migrant workers, whether we're talking about forced labor, we need to bring also the plight of those workers to the forefront. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much, Liam.
Thank you, Helska. I think that leading in from where Helska left us, I think the importance of making visible the invisible victims is really important at the moment. We heard her talk about the fact that 1 billion workers worldwide each year are exposed to hazardous chemicals. 1 million of those will die each year, and 1 in 5 asbestos. Those are big numbers, but actually what they really obscure is the real stories behind that. It's a great pleasure to introduce a colleague of mine, someone I've worked with for many years, Phil Hazelton from United Abroad, to talk about some of those real stories. There. Yeah, welcome, Phil.
So welcome, great to be here. And yes, I work for United Abroad Australia, which is the global justice organisation of the Australian trade union movement. This case study is currently unfolding with one of our partners in Indonesia, and we'll hear from them in a minute by a video clip. But basically, it's a very clear example of what the Rotterdam Convention failure to list, how it's being weaponised by certain industry. I think it's a stark example, and I think it fits with the last session of our of the COP as well in terms of unintended consequences of that non-listing. There's a bit of background. Indonesia is one of the biggest consumers of asbestos. Still over 100,000 tonnes a year are still being imported into Indonesia and manufactured mainly in asbestos roof sheet. And generally not a lot of restrictions on that and not a lot of awareness about that. Some of the percentage of houses in Jakarta, for example, are 50% asbestos containing. So this is quite a big issue, but it's not so well known. So very much an invisible problem in Indonesia, once again, because the medical system can't really detect asbestos diseases. So we can estimate through the WHO and other mechanisms of the global burden of disease, the number of workers that we think are dying in Indonesia right now, which is more than 1,000 every year. But they're not being picked up in the medical system, so very much invisible. So this case that we're about to hear about is an unusual one because our partner in that, an NGO in Indonesia, took a case to the Supreme Court of Indonesia last year in an effort to get labelling for asbestos-containing materials with a health warning, because they weren't getting a lot of action from the government, so they went straight to the Supreme Court. And so I think we can hear now from one of the people being sued currently. His name is Leo Yogapranata. He's been a lawyer and legal aid worker for 10 years, and he's currently the Director of Public Policy and Advocacy for the partner Lion. These are great graphics, by the way, from there. So maybe we'll just hear from Leo first, then we'll do a bit of dissecting.
Leo Yoga Pranata mewakili di Cisandewa, Ajat Sudrajat dan organisasi Yayasan Atta Budi yang dibentuk Lion Indonesia sebagai lembaga perlindungan konsumen. Bersama Lion Indonesia, kami telah lebih dari 12 tahun membantu pemerintah Republik Indonesia untuk mencegah jatuhnya korban penyakit akibat asbes di Indonesia. Pada tahun 2024, Indonesia telah memasuki babak baru perlindungan warga dari bahaya penyakit akibat asbes. Gugatan terhadap peraturan kewajiban labelisasi atas produk komersil atap yang mengandung asbes diterima oleh Mahkamah Agung Republik Indonesia. Melalui putusan Mahkamah Agung ini, pemerintah Republik Indonesia secara hukum telah mengakui dan menetapkan bahan baku krisotil asbestos dapat berdampak penyakit bagi warga. Karena itu perlu labelisasi dan informasi berbahaya yang harus disertakan dalam setiap produk yang dikomersilkan. Kemenangan warga negara yang bertindak demi perlindungan warga negaranya ini ternyata ditanggapi negatif oleh Asosiasi Industri Pengimpor dan Pengolah Bahan Baku Asbes di Indonesia. Secara pribadi, saya di Cisandewa dan Ajat Sudrajat, demikian juga dengan Yayasan Atta Budi dan Inaban, menghadapi gugatan ganti rugi yang nilainya lebih besar dari upah seumur hidup kami sebagai buruh di Indonesia. Kami digugat membayar lebih dari 79 miliar rupiah atau lebih dari 4,7 juta dolar Amerika karena upaya kami membantu pemerintah Indonesia mencegah kolapsnya sistem jaminan sosial Indonesia jika membiayai korban penyakit akibat asbes. Asosiasi Industri Asbes beralasan bahwa sampai hari ini asbes krisotil masih belum diatur sebagai bahan yang dinyatakan bahaya di dalam Konvensi Rotterdam. Secara serampangan, Asosiasi Industri Asbes mengutip belum adanya konsensus di dalam produk ini sebagai alasan untuk tidak perlunya label bahaya dalam produk atap yang mengandung asbes yang dikomersialkan di Indonesia. Kami merasakan gugatan ganti rugi oleh asosiasi industri ini sebagai upaya pembungkaman dan menjauhkan kami dari partisipasi aktif dan tanggung jawab sebagai warga negara. Kami beserta keluarga cemas atas perilaku industri yang mengancam kami sebagai warga yang terus dipinggirkan dalam pengelolaan negara yang baik. Ancaman dan pembungkaman ini semakin nyata karena Asosiasi Industri Asbes juga telah melibatkan organisasi-organisasi lain yang kontra terhadap keputusan Mahkamah Agung untuk menyerang kami secara pribadi dan organisasi. Kami berharap pimpinan konvensi yang terhormat saat ini berkenan memimpin pencapaian konsensus untuk memasukkan asbes krisotil ke dalam daftar aneks 3 atau setidaknya menyetujui jalan konvensi untuk menyepakati perubahan mekanisme pengambilan keputusan atau mengambil keputusan penting untuk semakin melindungi manusia, konsumen, dan pekerja dari bahaya penyakit akibat asbes. Asbes krisotil bukan hanya menjadi ancaman kesehatan, melainkan juga sudah menjadi ancaman hak demokrasi dan hak warga untuk terlibat dalam pembangunan yang lebih humanis. Semoga Majelis Konvensi mengambil keputusan penting untuk kemanusiaan yang lebih baik. Terima kasih.
So that's Leo, who, as you heard, as an individual staff member, is being sued, as well as other staff and all the NGOs who took a case to the Supreme Court and won. So the penalty for winning a Supreme Court case is a direct suit for damages. As you saw, nearly $5 million is being sought from local people who don't earn very much money. Pretty outrageous. So let me do a quick summary then of the case. So in case you didn't quite hear it, so 27th December, they put the case to the Supreme Court. And then after a lot of hearings and a lot of evidence around the world, and particularly Indonesia, Supreme Court agreed and said, yes, it should be labelled. And then in July, that was a little bit upset by the fact that the manufacturers of roof sheet asbestos took a court case at a district court against all those who took the case to the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court decision cannot be challenged, right? It's final. So this was an interesting strategy to try and get to the people who took the case at a lower level court. So that's been 8 months until February. The court case was going on, the costs of which were substantial. The stress on those organisations is very substantial because they were individually sued. All their houses will go if they lose. So in February, though, that court threw out the case, but largely on the basis that it wasn't the right jurisdiction. And 1 month later, where we are now, FICMA has appealed to a higher court. The manufacturers have now appealed to a higher court to extend the case even further. So that's what's happening in this particular example. So this was some of the justification that the manufacturers used in this case, right? And this is why we've got it here as a particularly interesting example, because they used the Rotterdam Convention as a basis for the suit. And the fact that COP11, chrysotile was not listed. But not only that, the inference was that their product was supported by the 170 countries who were here at the COP. So the wording is very broad, but the inference is that their product is being supported at this convention. And so they said there's no need for the country to label because it's not a hazardous product. It doesn't need to be prohibited, which is also a misrepresentation of what this conference does. So there's a lot of misuse of the facts that are going on here in a particular court case, which is very significant in Indonesia, but also for the region. So what have we got? We've got, there's been a clear ruling by the Supreme Court, and they've reviewed all the evidence, but manufacturers are unable to appeal there, so they are going for the activists instead. I think it's a bit of an outrage because it's really attempting to silence those actors, probably also to delay the labelling, because one of the groups also sued was the Ministry of Trade, not for money, but to try to convince them not to do the labelling. So I think to delay the labelling, because we know the industry wants to delay these decisions as long as possible or try and reverse them. So I think if we can't get these chemicals listed on Annex 3, we see quite a lot that this industry is misrepresenting what's happening here in the non-listing, in fact, in trying to increase sales of their product. So I think this is a very clear example for now of the need for reform of this convention as soon as possible, so we can get these sorts of chemicals listed. Thank you.
Thanks, Philip. I mean, obviously, there are a lot of things to take away from that presentation. I think there are two things that really stick in my mind. Firstly is the willingness of industry to use strategic lawsuits to really silence public participation and activists from doing things that are in the public interest. I think secondly, and pretty topically given the session that we just came out of, is how the Rotterdam Convention is being used outside of this place, and in particular, the unintended consequences, not of listing, but indeed of non-listing the substances. It's not just asbestos and chrysotile that this is happening. We're going to hand now to Sheila. We're going to talk about how this plays out when it comes to pesticides. Welcome, Sheila.
Thanks.
This one.
Yep.
Great. So I'm going to share a case study of some work in collaboration with other organisations in Tanzania to look at the problem of acute pesticide poisoning, which again is one of those large-scale problems. Louder, okay. I'll try. I'm going to speak about the impact of pesticides on people's health by sharing some information about a case study that we did in Tanzania. So first I'll give you a bit of background about the problem of acute pesticide poisoning, and then share the study in Tanzania, which is now in a peer-reviewed publication, so you can look at the details yourself. And then I'll compare those findings with the information from some other countries where we did similar studies. So first, to make the point about how robust data is needed, the FAO have pointed out that regular poisoning and health surveys should be carried out in rural areas to identify pesticide products and use practices that are harmful to farmers' health. We said that 9 years ago, but most countries still don't have good systems for collecting that data. And that's why we have tried to do some studies to fill that gap. We work with partners to address the important data gaps and particularly focusing on acute pesticide poisoning. We've heard about long-term chronic effects, but also the difficulty about connecting the chemical with those effects because of the time they take to show themselves. So this study is just looking at very short-term effects that occur within 24 hours of exposure. And we only ask the farmers about a 12-month period because they have good recall over that period. So doing everything to make that data as robust as possible in the absence of any other source of this kind of data. We focused on cotton farmers in this instance. We know that cotton is a very important crop in many countries, including in Tanzania, where about 500,000 households grow cotton and depend on it for their livelihood. We also know that cotton is one of the crops that uses large proportion of highly hazardous pesticides, and that there is a lack of comprehensive legislation to control and manage pesticides well. We also know that, as I mentioned, acute pesticide poisoning is severely underreported. And two very separate studies have shown that the level of reporting of incidents to formal medical services is around 6% of incidents reach medical services. When they do, those services are not set up to even diagnose the problems well, let alone record them and compile them in a way that we can tell which pesticides are causing these problems and under what circumstances. So we developed a study in collaboration with the TPHPA. This is the National Pesticide Regulatory Authority in Tanzania. Obviously the ones with the power to regulate these pesticides, but also recognizing that they lacked information on the problem. Also with MUHAS, which is the University of Health and Allied Sciences in Dar es Salaam, and with a local civil society organisation, Agenda, alongside our own organisation, Pesticide Action Network. We have developed a tool that's easy to use in the field to collect this kind of data for use on mobile apps, and that's why we were also involved. So we did a cross-sectional survey of over 1,000 cotton farmers, farm workers in the northwest of Tanzania, which is a heavy cotton growing area. And it was requesting self-reporting health effects from those farmers and farm workers. We also recorded the severity of the symptoms. We used binary logistic regression to identify risk factors for acute pesticide poisoning.
Maybe it'd be my magic touch.
Good. So just to give you some of the findings in terms of the conditions of use of pesticides. So when a pesticide is launched onto the market in Tanzania, a lot of the assumptions by regulatory authorities are based on the fact that the assumption that farmers will follow the label instructions and that they are using them in certain ways. when you go into the field, you understand that that's not the case, and that's not the farmer's fault. Sometimes, you know, for example, the protective equipment is not available, not affordable, not wearable under those environmental conditions. So when you register a hazardous product into that environment, you know for sure people are going to be poisoned because the conditions that you based your assumptions on are not there. So we found that 90% of the cotton farmers were using pesticides. Most of them were using manual backpack sprayers, and that can be a problem. We've seen a lot of problems from leaking backpack sprayers. People spend the whole day with their back and their lower back in particular soaked in pesticides. We found that 48% of respondents experienced acute health impacts within 24 hours of exposure to the pesticide over just a 12-month period. Nearly half the farmers say they've experienced signs and symptoms of acute pesticide poisoning. Just 24% of the farmers said they'd received training on protective equipment. The most common protective equipment that people used were boots, Wellington boots. Most of the farmers, 64%, were just normal clothes, non-protective clothes when they're spraying. 73% of the farmers said that they received their pesticides from extension services, so within the government kind of distribution system. And 99% were purchased in their original containers with the labels. So they're not having pesticides that are mixed in a local shop into a Coca-Cola bottle that we see very commonly, and it's very hazardous and horrible. In this case, they were purchasing the original container, so they had the label and they knew what they were being poisoned by.
There you go.
So this is probably the most interesting slide in that we could relate what people were exposed to with their symptoms. And we found that actually just a handful of pesticides accounted for most of the incidents of acute pesticide poisoning. And high among them, number 2 in the ranking, was chlorpyrifos products. It was being very widely used and very highly associated with incidents of acute pesticide poisoning, alongside profenifos, which is the story. So what were those health impacts? Of course, we didn't measure fatalities because we were surveying farmers who could report the symptoms. And actually, it's quite difficult to get hold of fatality data, unfortunately, because we know fatalities happen. In this case, the symptoms were severe headaches, abnormal skin conditions, muscle weakness, tremors, abnormal movements, visual disturbance, permanent paralysis by a small but significant proportion of those people, and then respiratory system effects and increased salivation, difficulty urinating, constipation. So a wide range of effects, some of them extremely severe, all of them very concerning. And that's just the acute effects. To me, the acute effects are like an iceberg that are really signalling some big concerns about the chronic effects. So again, in this study, it confirmed a previous study that only 6% of farmers had sought formal medical treatment, and that shows the invisibility of this problem to national authorities, despite the fact that 48% of farmers were experiencing health problems. They were also missing work. There are economic impacts to this. And 73 individuals said they'd missed time at work. One individual had missed 60 days of work due to the impacts of pesticides on their health. And we know that suitable alternatives are available to chlorpyrifos in cotton. There's a thriving organic cotton sector in Tanzania and in other parts of Africa. So there's real expertise in the region, in Ethiopia, in Benin, Tanzania and elsewhere. There's expertise, there are alternatives. There is really no excuse to be using such a hazardous pesticide that is having a significant impact on people's health. Nearly there. So I just wanted to share with you, we've published this study. It's available in a peer-reviewed paper. And a quote from the head of the toxicology unit at the National Regulatory Authority, which was that this large-scale study provides important new evidence of the impact of hazardous pesticide use on the health of farmers and workers in Tanzania. Large numbers of farmers reporting pesticide poisoning is alarming and warrants swift action, particularly in relation to the few pesticides that were associated with most of the incidents. So we're looking forward to swift action this week. Slides. So just to bring that back to the convention and the importance of sharing information, there's a problem in Tanzania in that the research mandate has been removed from the regulatory authority. So it's difficult in Tanzania to collect this kind of information. And it's not just Tanzania. Every country we work in has problems with post-registration surveillance systems and a lack of data in this area. And that severely impedes their ability to take informed decisions and necessary actions to protect farmers and rural communities. And that's why we see the Rotterdam Convention is so important, to share information where it is available, make it available to national authorities so that they can take informed decisions on chemicals such as chlorpyrifos and add them to Annex 3. But I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheila. So we heard from Philip about how this is playing out in relation to industrial chemicals, but we've also heard from Sheila about the significant impact this has in relation to pesticides. We're now going to hand to Magda to provide a bit of a party's perspective on what's going on with the Rotterdam Convention and how we might break through some of this impasse. Over to you, Magda.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Well, from the site part, I can speak on behalf of one of the EU members. So from our perspective, what is happening right now with the convention, which is undermined and which is used in a way, as for example, was mentioned based on the example from Indonesia, in absolutely opposite way than it was created for. This is really, I will use word scaring. This is something what should be loudly said. This is something what should be between the states, especially those who promote convention, who want convention to still develop and to serve as a tool for protecting workers, protecting vulnerable groups, protecting human and environment. It's very important to bear that in mind and to give that message that what we do here, in the moment when we let for not listing, at the same time, let for more than just not sending messages to others. Because what is the aim of this convention? To share information, to give chance to others to make informed choice. And we all the time for us, this is important. But it seems that as a states, we should even try to give the message. Look from all possible angles. What kind of consequences may have that we do not decide here? What kind of consequences may have the fact that we undermine the work of the committee, that we undermine efforts of countries, because the whole work starts from the level of the country, which provide us final regulatory actions, then there is committee, and then there is COP. So for us as EU, and also Poland, the situation is really alarming and difficult to accept, even because we see, while negotiating different things, absolute lack of will, of understanding, or maybe this is purposely using arguments which should not be used in case of this convention. So this is something really worrying, and it starts to even go a bit in direction of bullying those who want to do things. We try our best. We have a system, we have regulation which implements Rotterdam Convention in EU, based on which we listed more than 200 chemicals which are banned or restricted, severely restricted as a pesticides, as biocides, as industrial chemicals. So all of them we put together in regulation implementing Rotterdam Convention. So we created much broader the scope, and we put on ourselves the obligation that whenever it is exported, we bilaterally contact potential importing country. So this shows that despite I know there are some cases when maybe not necessarily all EU countries follow what they should do. Yes, I know. However, this is the priority for us, and we all the time repeat it. And we are frustrated with the fact that we speak about the tool that should just let others to have access to information, to let them to see something what is not visible, because if you don't have information, you cannot understand what you're really faced with. So this is, as has been said regarding the human rights, you take away something very important to human workers, to families, because you put them in a position without possibility of deciding, in a position that they should choose between safety, between life, at the same time, without being aware what they are choosing. So we are speaking here constantly that Rotterdam is not a ban. Listing does not mean that you cannot sell the chemical. Listing does not mean that you cannot use the chemical. But this is message which unfortunately does not work anymore. So there is really needed from states and from those for whom this convention is important. There is needed another message. And we need to build on that kind of examples, which has been shown, to pass it to states. Otherwise, it will be really difficult to protect convention, to protect us. Thank you very much.
Magda. So I'm going to open it up for questions in a minute, but I might first start with one of my own to get the ball rolling. We've heard from Anna Paula and from Halska about the importance of having a rights-based approach and a real concern that the convention is being subjected to corporate capture. We've heard from Halska about the devastating numbers of workers that are exposed to hazardous chemicals and the many that die from them, including hundreds of thousands that are exposed chemicals that we have failed to list in this COP that have been recommended. But also we heard from two really great case studies about how the convention is being used, but indeed how it's just not meeting its full potential and providing a right to know, not just for workers, but indeed for parties to be able to make informed decisions about how chemicals are dealt with. And one of the criticisms I think that's evolved become the place where chemicals go to die. In other words, we don't list chemicals that we're still trading. I think we can all agree this is a complete waste of time if that's what we're here to do. So my first question, which I'm going to hand to Sheila, but then invite others to open up on, is why should parties that haven't banned a chemical or pesticide support listing on the annex?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it comes back to the point that was just made that, you know, this fusion of false argument about banning. It's not about banning, it's about helping governments take informed decisions. So many governments lack the information they need. I've seen in Tanzania that they're really blind to the problem of acute pesticide poisoning. They don't have the surveillance systems, and that's not just Tanzania, that's so many countries that we work in. So this convention was designed to support them, to help them access information that could help inform their decision making. And then it's up to them if they want to ban or do something else. It just helps them manage that hazard and protect their people. And so there's absolutely no reason to confuse listing with banning. And we continually hear parties today in plenary saying, oh, we've banned it or we've not banned it, and therefore we're going to do this. That's irrelevant. They're denying themselves access to information, and then they can decide for themselves. So yeah. So that's why they should list, is so that they can access information and make the decision themselves.
I just like to make a comment shortly that we should also unfortunately remember that now quite big political and economical influence is here, and it's very difficult to persuade parties to use another language and not from another perspective. If it will be possible to change, I really hope so, because it's something that we all are trying to do. But I also would appeal to others to work on that. Language here is important. Words which are used here are very misleading during all plenaries which we have on listing.
Any others? I'll open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience.
This is a very grim situation, and it requires people like me, observers, to be proactive. If nothing is ever done, you see people suffering, you see people dying from cancers. We have to take the initiative and educate the people, because coming here, I've learned so much. And I'm not going to sit down and wait till members decide to list or not. The science has given the information that it's harming human health. It's harming, nature, the ecosystems. So why should we know this information and not do anything? Because when the people know, you're going to see a change, and they're who going to bring the change. I'm going home. I already have an interview with the radio station, and this is going to be my topic: the ineffectiveness of the Rotterdam Convention. And I'm going to speak on the airways, and I know the people are going to listen, because I can't be here. It really bothers me that, nothing is being done. Don't sit down and wait, people. When you go home, educate the people. And when the people know, the power is in the people. We have the Escazú Agreement.
Yeah.
We can demand access to information.
And the ILO's convention.
Yes, we can access information, and we have to take actions. I'm really very concerned. Thank you.
Next.
Thank you. I mean, to complement on that, one could recommend parties to actually not wait for listing, but to take the fact that the CRC has recommended a substance to be listed as the reference, take action. But I actually want to ask a question to Magda and actually all delegates that are present here, because we had this discussion just before in plenary about the Brazilian CRP and the sort of counter proposal of the EU. And in both these proposals, they refer to, I made the statement about these voluntary certification schemes. And there's this idea in the room that parties should engage with these voluntary schemes to explain to them, even though they already know it perfectly well, what the what the convention is about and what listing under Annex 3 means. Maybe to balance that possible decision that might be taken at the end of this conference, one should insert a paragraph in that decision that parties are asked to engage with their industry to ensure that industry does not misrepresent when the COP decides not to list a product, so that what happened in Indonesia cannot happen any longer.
Good idea, suggestion.
Well, suggestion, I can absolutely forward that to our member states, but well, if something like that is possible, I don't know. I will not say. However, you've probably noticed one thing today during the plenary when was discussion about chemicals, that was one of the industry representatives speaking why chemicals should not be listed, using arguments which at the end are in the CRP of Brazil. What unfortunately clearly shows that we must try to find the way how to engage industry to understand, or maybe engage them to try to want to understand, because this is very difficult. And the issue is that this is not so harming convention. This is not something what should face problems. But on the other hand, there are some systems which nationally countries, with which countries are involved in a different way on national level. And sometimes for them probably it's difficult to find a way out. So they try to undermine something what in their opinion could be the reason. Absolutely wrong way, wrong approach. So, well, I can propose. I cannot promise anything.
Thank you. Really, all the presentation is very good. But really, as an observer, I feel strange when today in the plenary about one type of pesticide, all the countries is talk about diseases and the children infect and environmental deterioration. And some countries, it's talk like in a good way. If you ban this pesticide, our economy will affect. We need it for agriculture. How we deal, from experience, how we deal with this situation. Really, it make us is affected about health. You pay the same if you want the economy and the money, but you will pay diseases and chronic diseases, deaths, a lot of things. Thank you.
And Sheila, but I think that was my
Thank you for that really thoughtful question. I completely agree. It's devastating hearing that, and not least because those economic arguments don't hold either.
Yeah.
We ourselves are directly involved in organic cotton programs, and in those programs, farmers are making much more profit from their cotton without those chemicals than with them, because actually agrochemicals are very expensive and the price has gone up through the roof in the last few years. If you use safer alternatives, you're better off economically, as well as your health, your community, your environment. In Benin, for example, the last study that we did, the farmers were earning 3 times more profit that were growing without these chemicals than the the local farms growing with chlorpyrifos. And more than 90% of those farmers with chlorpyrifos were getting poisoned each year. So those economic arguments don't hold either. But, you know, there are lock-ins and the industry has a very persuasive voice.
Yeah, thank you. Just to touch on that, because it's a very important question, and I think we need to raise awareness also of the productivity losses and the economic impacts from all of these deaths and diseases. And Sheila, what you were showing too about the percentage of farmers that were experiencing health problems, you know, someone might say, look at it and say, oh, it's a headache or it's vision problems or something like this. But like you said, it's the tip of the iceberg, but also it's a snapshot. It's one acute moment, right? This person likely will be a pesticide applicator for many years, right? Throughout the seasons, there's very little job diversity in these informal structures, right? And so this is just leading up to long-term chronic impacts that have a devastating impact also economically. And so we have projections that also show that the OSH impacts from exposures in the workplace are up to 4% of a country's GDP. It's huge, right? Just from occupational exposures. And this is where I think why I talk about the multi-sectoral engagement, because I think we can learn a bit from how the labor sector has done this. The ILO brings to the same table employers, workers, and governments. And the employers come to the table because they know there's productivity loss. It's not just about the human-centered, rights-based approach, which is of course important. It's about economic losses, right? And so bringing all the stakeholders together has a huge benefit. The Chemicals Convention was created in 1990. And back then, there was 187 member states in the room and employers' organizations, some representing industry, that agreed to that provision that I showed you in our Chemicals Convention of informed consent. So there was an understanding that this is also beneficial to the world of work as a whole and not just something of a ban, right? And so I think it's an important way to perhaps carry over a best practice from different sectors to see how it could apply to the stakeholders here.
I think it's a really good point that you raise in relation to the listings this afternoon, but it's not just, pesticides. We see it in industrial chemicals as well. And it's a common argument that's used for chrysotile and continuing the use of asbestos sheets remains that sort of economic argument. And as Philip points out, disease is very hard to detect. And so you're constantly in this battle, but you might want to say a bit more on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to summarise what this Indonesian example I think really exposes for the tactics they're using in controlling the Rotterdam Convention. If you look at what they're doing in Indonesia, they're saying to the Indonesian government, unless it's listed, don't need to regulate it, don't need to label it, it's not dangerous. It's only dangerous if it's listed, but they control the listing so they've got both sides. They're laughing because they blocked the listing and then they argue that we all support their product misleadingly. So they've got complete circle. So I think that's why we need a real reform to say to block a small number of parties being able to do this, like we tried last time. But we have to come back to something like that. Otherwise, that corporate capture will continue.
What's really interesting about your story, the labelling story actually embodies the whole principle of Rotterdam. The ideal of actually giving people a right to know of the product. But at the same time, they're suing the people who forced that right to know. Actually quantify for them just the simple act of letting people know that our product is dangerous will cause economic loss. And it's just there for everybody to see. And to do it and abuse, essentially, distort what the convention does is a real, it's doing us all a disservice. But Anna?
Yeah, I think the case that you showed in Indonesia, that for me is an example of something we call SLAPS, which is strategic litigation against public participation. That is outlawed in many countries. So we know these tactics that the industry use to fear into people seeking justice. Well, and then you mentioned corporate capture, and it's not only here. We know that most environment, I would say all environment negotiations are predominantly captured by vested interests. What do? We know that, of course, the less we want our regulations to work. So courts are the last resort. But when you are trying everything and nothing works, there are more resources and there are other mechanisms. ILO has mechanisms of compliance, human rights mechanisms that are also venues for that. bring their voice. If you keep the discussion centered just here, you are not going to exercise the pressure that is needed to create the changes. I mean, ideally, we need rules of procedures changes in so many of these conventions, not even Rotterdam. Are we going to achieve? I don't know. I think it's unlikely in the temperature, like in the world that we live nowadays. But we need to exercise this pressure. So be aware that there are other avenues that you can also raise and put more pressure on Rotterdam. And let's expose those who are here, lobbyists, industry, who are those that are, I mean, going against their people or against people, against lives to just make. So I have to say.
I'm going to go next to Sue and then I'll back up.
Yeah, no, thanks for great presentations. I'm Sue Longley. I work for the Global Union that represents agricultural workers. I think one of the things that actually, and I've been thinking what the verb is, most disgusted me in the plenary session just now was a number of governments saying that the answer was personal protective equipment. Because all the information that we get from our affiliates confirms exactly Sheila's points. Workers don't get personal protective equipment. In many cases, if they do, it's inappropriate for the job. And with increasing heat, it becomes increasingly inappropriate. But we heard also that the ILO has now made health and safety a fundamental right. So it's the same governments in there. If I understand correctly, health ILO policy, it has a very strict hierarchy of hazard controls, which puts PPE at the bottom of the list after the elimination, substitution, and the rest. So I'm really interested to think what we can do more around this to use it as a tool to get joined up thinking. And then my other 2 points on invisible. I mean, for us also, PPE is defined for the male physiognomy. It's not designed for female workers, and yet more and more women work in agriculture. They don't have the right equipment, and it doesn't protect them. The other huge, well, exposure levels are also set on the male physiognomy. The other big thing in agriculture, 70% of all child labour in the world takes place in agriculture alone. So lots and lots and lots, millions of children are also being exposed because they're working in fields instead of being in school. You know, so sometimes I feel we're still thinking in like this, and we need to think much more joined up about how we get mobilized around many of these issues. But I agree with the sister here. This lot are not going to sort it out for us. We have to get the information out, make sure that our members are aware, make sure that the public is aware, and have a much stronger campaigning voice. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to hand to Hoshka in a minute, but you touched on a point that was really dear to my heart that I heard. Or this idea we talk about in our country, I think policymakers need to be aware of this idea of like the work imagined versus the work reality. I think many people here think that every worker understands what's on a label, that every worker has access to PPE, that there are not other economic pressures that are going to drive them to do work faster or for whatever reason not use PPE. And that's why, and it's very rare that you get to talk about a hierarchy of controls in any sort of meeting, but it's why these are the sort of things that are so ineffective when there are such better alternatives such as substitution or elimination. But over to Elshka.
Yeah, quickly. Thank you so much, Sue, for those words. It's exactly that. It's the same governments, right? What you said. The government in the room that is talking about this is from the environment, but at home, they've maybe ratified ILO conventions that are protecting the workers from these pesticides. So this is where the multi-sectoralism is so important. And Sue, you said in the other side event that we were lucky enough to be together in as well, that we're talking to the like-minded people in the room, right? So we need to bring the world of work. We need to bring ministries of health. We need to bring the employers and the workers here to also bring those messages. The idea about PPE, the Ministry of Labor knows the realities that the Ministry of Labor also knows the impacts to productivity, right? And so all of these things can help also promote a more effective process. So that's multi-sectoralism for the win. Yes.
All right, I'm going to go up the back and then last question here because I'm going to take on the sisters' call and everyone here is going to go out and spread the message. There's still contact groups to go and do that in. So,
hello, Fernando Bejarano from the Pesticide Action Network in Mexico. I think that the service is more a public awareness campaign previous to these meetings because it has been very frustrating. They're repeating the same old argument. I think some people probably believe that this is a WTO meeting instead of Rotterdam Convention. So the trade issues are more relevant than health environment. is a symptom of a lack of democracy inside of the countries. When you have a focal point on agriculture, and this is captured on our mentality of green revolution, and also have a process to consult any other stakeholders, even workers, then the result is this. So it's a lack of internal democracy consultation, and we need to invest more also in the communication among workers, farm workers across the globe, sharing that critique. So they are holding the transformation in agriculture that is needed in agroecology, and they are holding the emerging of the new sector of the market, who is more on bioinputs and more on organics. Thank you.
Sure, maybe you might want to talk to this, but Halshka, probably expands on what you were just saying about how do we ensure that we have better multi-sectoral engagement at these sorts of meetings, that it's not just dominated by environment or agriculture, and that broader perspectives are brought in. Maybe from you, and then maybe how it works in your own.
Yeah, because it's true, the ILO always advocates for it, but the realities are very difficult, right? Communication at the national level, engagement with different ministries. How do we make that a reality?
In reality,
Yeah.
it's always difficult.
Yeah.
Even if all of us know that there exists a problem,
Yeah.
and all of us know that we must take actions, then when we start to discuss is, but I have this priority, now this is not the moment, I have that priority, it's not exactly the moment. But what is important is the fact that the idea of need of cooperating starts to be more and more visible and recognized, because more often we speak about things which overlap. So there is no possibility on the national level just to avoid some issues. For us, it's also a bit easier probably because we follow European law. So we know from that base that when we look in one regulation, we should look even in another one. And in that case, we should find on our national level adequate institution that works with that. So we have indications with whom to work, and then how to work. This is our issue, how we organize that. But important is that awareness is now we should act to increase it and make more broad in different parties.
Final question. You're at the front.
Comment, yeah. Roland Weber from International Panel on Chemical Pollution. We already heard about the industrial chemicals, and this case, which I shortly explained, will shed 2 additional issues for the Rotterdam Convention where there are challenges. This is chlorinated paraffins. So short-chain chlorinated paraffins have been listed 2017. In my estimate, we had around production around 400,000 tons a year. They were listed also in Rotterdam Convention, but I think that over all the years, there was not a single big procedure for it. Why? One thing is that mixtures are produced where countries are not labeling. The second is that there were no specific HS codes. And then a big part of it goes into products. There we come to the labeling. This means in China, for example, directly 90% of the chlorinated paraffins come into PVC products and rubber products, and then they are exported without anybody knowing what is in it. So we have done an assessment. I mean, with Beijing University, we have done a study, analyzed 124 products and found 70% are in PVC. And when we then calculate these kind of PVC, which are exported for Nigeria, we have estimated that over 20 years, around 100,000 tons of short and medium chain chlorinated paraffins were imported in products to Nigeria. And therefore now I think this was a kind of failure. We also said this in the paper. And now medium chain paraffins will be listed. Yeah. So I hope that, I mean, from these lessons learned for the short chain paraffins 2017, there should be one learning thing, that the countries which are producing it are really knowing what they are producing and telling what they are producing. Then we will need a real HS code for the medium chain chlorinated paraffins. And then we really need to think about products when they contain medium chain chlorinated paraffins, that we also have something. Yeah.
anyone wants to talk that specifically, but obviously I think very concerning what you're
And I mean, medium chain chlorinated paraffins are, for example, metalworking fluids, where you have really 100% of 50% and you directly come into contact, and they will have an exemption until 2036. Medium chain. Yeah. And to add to it, I would say that in a few years, the short and medium chain chlorinated paraffin together will have the highest concentration of all crops in human milk. At the moment, still DDT is the highest, but for industrial countries, already the paraffins are the highest. And tea production, last one stopped, kind of. Yeah, so we will see, I think, in a few years that this is the highest category.
Well, that is very concerning, and yeah, horrifying. But it makes me also reflect on the opportunity we've got. We look back 20 years ago next year is when the first chemical was blocked. We did some rough estimations earlier today about the number of people that have died from Prasatal alone since then, and it's a number that's greater than 3 million. A third of the population in this country, all because we failed to list this chemical. And so I don't want to be here. In fact, I can guarantee I won't be here in 2045, but I definitely don't want to be here looking at a list of an even longer number of chemicals, because one thing's for sure, there's no way this COP gets done in 2 weeks. It'll take us months if this continues to go this far. So please join me in thanking Magda, Hauschka, Sheila, Anna, and Philip for the great presentation. Spread the word. The purpose of these is not to just talk to those that agree with us, it's to go out there and persuade others the importance of what we're talking about. So thank you, everybody.
And thank you
have
to the
a-
organizers. Yeah.
Done. It's over. That's the main thing. Go back to bed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the listing one.
Yeah.
Oh, the listing one, well.
Meet you and hope to see you at the meetings. Keep up the good work. Yeah. Yeah, the people. Sorry. She's one of she is you hear what this lady said? I didn't even know she knows me and she's telling me.
So late.
But the first one to the right of the.
Sorry, it was so late.
Got to be.
Yes, yeah.
We work it.
You're very good.